Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this seminar, I think we properly call it, on professionalism. The Inner Temple is a professional association, for those of you who need reminding, which promotes values which underpin the rule of law by educating and training barristers. It leads thought in the area, and through the voluntary efforts of our barristers and judicial members, provides a mutually supportive network which assists in maintaining the integrity and excellence of our profession. That's sort of my definition. It's not Ian's, but I think relevantly for tonight, it's what an Inn of Court does. I thought I would organise, this is an entirely personal event, so everyone can blame me for it, because having had some years of experience of the woes and tribulations of other professions, namely medicine, nursing in particular, it struck me that there was something common about the value of professions that we perhaps don't always remember. And I thought it was particularly relevant for us as lawyers to think about this at a time when, frankly, there are beginning to be quite unacceptable outright attacks on the work we do and the people who do it. And it struck me that, therefore, we need to start a discussion in collaboration with colleagues from other walks of life about what we could possibly do about it. And it seems to me one of the things that we can do about it is spend more of our time explaining to others the value of what we do in terms of ethics, values, and the importance to society. And in that, perhaps, we could all help each other a little bit. So I have assembled a panel of distinguished speakers from the legal world and other professions to give their own thoughts, really, about the challenges we face and what perhaps we can do about them. So I'm going to make a few introductory remarks of my own. It's my privilege as chair to do that before handing over to our speakers. I'm going to introduce each of them individually as they come to speak to you. There will be time for questions both from the audience in the room and those online after that. And after that, for those of you who don't think you've had a proper say, my speakers have kindly agreed to stand at a speed dating table each outside so that those who are here can approach them and give them a bit of their own mind. If it gets too out of control, we will retreat immediately, but usually it works quite well, so I'm grateful to our speakers for agreeing to do that. When you ask questions before that, however, I will ask you to limit yourself to a question, not a speech. And any suggestion of a speech coming from any member of the audience will be ruthlessly dealt with by me. So, why are we here? Well, we will all be familiar with this piece of wisdom from Mr. Gove at a time that I'm sure we'd all rather forget. But it was something that caused concern at the time. And I think it's something, even though Mr. Gove will say, and I think probably correctly, he was unfairly misquoted by the Prince, and there's more to what he said than that. But it did seem to me at the time that it was part of a process whereby when an expert opinion is expressed, whether it be by an economist or a lawyer or somebody else, instead of responding to the argument and the merits of the argument and producing evidence, if necessary, to rebut it, the easier thing to do would be to attack the person who makes the argument. And another thing is just to reject expertise as being relevant at all. And it seems to me, at least, that that is at the beginning of a slippery slope. Of course, again, I know we all like to forget about Brexit now. I've got thoroughly bored with it. But we will all, in the legal profession, remember this outburst in the press when some judges made a decision inconvenient to one point of view, which got out of hand, frankly, and by common consent, those who should know better in the political establishment did nothing to defend either the legal profession or the rule of law, or even begin to explain to the public what the function of the legal system and judges were in this circumstance. And I found that, as I'm sure you did, particularly concerning. But it's not stopped, has it? And I won't bore you with slides about it. But I mean, just looking at the phrase on the screen for a moment, what have any of the, leaving aside the utter offence at the final description of a judge, which even for the relevant newspaper, I think was well below the line of any form of decency. What does any of those facts, if they be facts, have to do with the validity or otherwise of a legal opinion given by independent judges weighing up legal arguments that are being put before them? But the problem with this is that people read that, they think of judges as being, therefore, as people who are sort of a bit like politicians and not to be trusted. And that is the way we end up with either chaos or worse, perhaps, totalitarianism. Judges who are, there becomes an expectation that judges will do what they're instructed to do. And we know of countries, of course, where that is the case. But of course, since then, much more recently, we have had a continuous stream of suggestions that lawyers are activists. The phrase activist lawyer is hammered home week in, week out, because there are lawyers who have the temerity to go to tribunals and make arguments in favour of people trying to claim asylum or whatever immigration rights in this country, all in accordance with laws passed by various governments. And instead of, well, they are now beginning to say we'll change the law, we could argue forever about that, but instead of doing that, they complain about the decisions being made as being made by or as a result of arguments by activists, as opposed to lawyers who are doing their job. So the one thing I'd like to end with this before I hand over to our first speaker is that actually it's not working. Every year Ipsos Mori produce a poll of the public's trust in the veracity of various professions. Unfortunately, their 2023 poll must be literally about to come out, but hasn't yet. But as you would probably expect, nurses and doctors always come near the top of the league. Recently, in fact, doctors have been relegated from first place by nurses. And for some odd reason, this last year, engineers suddenly popped up from nowhere in between the two. But I suppose we should not be surprised that 89% of the population think that nurses are likely to tell the truth, and 85% doctors. I suppose it is quite reassuring that judges are fairly high up on the list, and 80% of the population think that they are true. Jane will be glad to know that professors are on an equal standing with judges in terms of telling the truth. I don't know about any other accomplishment. But lawyers, actually, as a whole, aren't doing too badly at 57%, if only because they come above the ordinary man and woman in the street, and even above car mechanics, which is really saying quite something. Charity chief executives are a bit surprisingly, though you might think. Estate agents, of course, we always think of them being down the bottom of the pile, but to find them there with journalists is very satisfactory. And I think this is the first year that politicians have actually come bottom of the poll at 12%. So it seems to me that maybe a reason that politicians spend so much time attacking other people is because they realise no one trusts them, and therefore they want no one to be trusted at all. But anyway, that is all I want to say by way of opening. I would now like to introduce, if I may, Professor Jane Dacre to you. She is currently president of the Medical Protection Society, an organisation to whom I owe a great debt of gratitude as having provided me with my income for most of my professional life. She is a distinguished rheumatologist and has been heavily involved in medical education as Professor of Medical Education at University College London. She is a former president of the Royal College of Physicians and, if I may say so, has been a powerful role model for women in leadership positions. And it was notable that at the time of her presidency, that position in virtually all the major royal colleges was in fact held by women. She's a past member of the General Medical Council and is therefore familiar with the concepts of professional discipline. And amongst many other roles, she is currently chair of an independent panel of experts advising the Health and Social Care Select Committee on the vexed subject of whether advising the Select Committee on the extent to which the government actually implements its commitments in the role of health. And that won't tell you what the examination answer is to that question, which you can probably guess. So I'm going to hand over to Dame Jane Dacre.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you very much for inviting me here today. I can't tell you how terrifying it is for me as a doctor to be addressing you lot, so be gentle with me. So I start by saying, hello, I'm Jane, and I'm a doctor. I am also a professional. And the question arises in what we're saying, what we're discussing today, is what is a professional? What is a profession? A profession, I think, is a disciplined group of people who share ethical standards, who have a high level of skills, who share altruism, and who can be trusted. And I'm quite pleased that doctors are still there near the top of the list, and you guys are kind of a little bit lower down, but not quite so far down as the politicians and the estate agents. So in 2005, the Royal College of Physicians, of which I was president later, under my colleague Dame Carol Black, sparked a piece of work that went on to describe professionalism for doctors. And this is the piece of work in the blue booklet here, which is Doctors in Society, Medical Professionalism in a Changing World. And this was sparked because at that time it was felt that the professionalism of doctors was being eroded by the external environment and by the way that people treated us as doctors. And they at the time came up with a definition of professionalism which suggested that medical professionalism is a set of values, behaviours and relationships that underpin the trust that patients, that the public have in doctors. The word trust is really important there, and what we're talking about today is the erosion of trust and how we as professionals stop that erosion. And there is increasingly a gap in the medical profession, and I suspect it may be similar for lawyers, in what doctors are trained to do and the realities of modern practice. And that's something that we've been trying to address. So within medicine, you read about the problems in the newspapers in the same way as we read about the problems with law. And I suspect that if I asked you what those problems were, you'd be able to come up with the same list as I'm going to tell you now. So there are big problems with workforce shortages. There are simply not enough healthcare professions to do the work that there are. So how do you maintain your professionalism in those conditions? There are poor working conditions. A lot of the estate of our NHS is pretty hopeless, with leaky roofs, with that bubbly concrete, the aero concrete, that the buildings that are falling down. There is pay that is falling behind, and there's a concept of something called pay restoration, which is that particularly the junior doctors think that they deserve 35% more than they're actually getting, and they're not going to get that from the government. All of these things impact on the well-being and the sense of professionalism of doctors. Coupled with that is the rise in the expectations of patients and the public as to what they feel they deserve from the NHS, what they ought to be able to get from the NHS, such that when somebody who's extremely elderly dies, they see it as a shock. So the environment that we live in is very different and very hostile. And again, on top of that, there's the expanding knowledge base with genomics, with science, with curing cancer. So all of that is getting out of hand. And we're doing that with an ageing population, so everybody is at us all at the same time. So there's continuing external and internal threats to our professionalism as doctors. And a bit like lawyers, doctors have been accused of being activists. Now, some doctors these days are activists. Some of the junior doctors are saying that they are supporting the best interests of the patients of tomorrow by ensuring that they're paid well enough today. So there is a question about whether that is professional behaviour. Is the current industrial action by our trainees good for the future of the patients, or is it good for the doctors of the future? It's very difficult to tell, and we are not always judged in a positive way by the press and the media. But there are those that say we should be seeing the label of being an activist as a badge of honour. We are standing up for our profession. And my friend and colleague David Oliver in the BMJ wrote in 2020 that without activists, for example, women wouldn't have the vote. So without activists, I wouldn't be here today, would I? I would be at home making supper for my husband, and I'm not. So what should we as professionals do to enhance and maintain the understanding of professionalism and our position as professions? So in my view, medicine and the law are professions. It's not just a job. However, our definition of professionalism needs to keep up to date. Now, that can be supported by the regulators, but it's an internal thing that is innate to us as professionals. We should always understand, in my view, and behave professionally. So back in 2005, when this report, Doctors in Society, was written, it was chaired by Baroness Cumberledge. They came up with the definition that's written here. In 2015, a number of years later, we decided to revisit that when I was president of the college. But actually, we decided to stick with the same definition. However, that definition needs to have a context that is updated to current practice. And so that's what we've been doing. And we were actually helped by you, Robert, and set up a group to look at professionalism and where we were now, and how to interpret medical professionalism for today. And what we did was define 7 characteristics of professionalism. So characteristic 1 is the one that everybody understands doctors do, which is the doctor as a healer. So that goes back to Hippocrates. It's in the GMC's Good Medical Practice, which say things like make the care of the patient your primary concern, and first do no harm. So that's an obvious one. That is one of the characteristics of professionalism. The second is that the doctor now is a partner to patients. So we have to understand that relationship between patient and doctor has changed. We are expected to have a much more equal relationship. And so as a professional, the doctor needs to be a patient partner. The third is the doctor as a team worker. And that's because we no longer do things on our own. Everything that happens in an operating theatre or in my clinical practice is done with a group of like-minded colleagues. So as a professional, we have to be able to relate to, work with, and be part of a team. The fourth is the doctor as a manager and a leader, because In order to change things for the better as professionals, we need to step up to the plate and we need to be able to manage the environment around us. So we as doctors primarily work in the National Health Service. The National Health Service has a big challenge in management and leadership. And our view as medical professionals is that we ought to be there at the table. We aren't always. The next is the doctor as an advocate, not only advocating for our patients, but also, as I referred to earlier, advocating for the system in which we're in. And sometimes that might mean that it's okay for a doctor to be an activist. The fifth is the doctor as a learner and teacher. So as professionals, our job is to bring on the next generation of the profession. And there's a great culture in medicine, and I would hope in the law, of bringing on the next generation of professionals. And the last is the doctor as an innovator. Because of that exponential increase in knowledge and increase in what we can do with our patients, we need to understand it, we need to be leading that, and we need to be participating in that. So those become the context within which the doctor as a professional should be seen. And that was back in 2015. And what I would say is, as medicine evolves, although the definition of professionalism in medicine may not change, the context in which that definition exists does change. So we need to be ready to revisit and provide more context so that professionalism keeps up to date and is relevant to the present day. And that way, I hope that we will maintain that trust and we maybe will get back up to number one in Robert's list. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for that, Jane, and for the work you have done on professionalism. It reminds me that I've met a wonderful person in Dublin who I don't think has an equivalent here, I may be wrong, who is employed by they still have a Royal College of Surgeons in Dublin. Don't ask me why, but they're still at Royal College of Surgeons. And they do a lot of the training, not only of surgeons, but other doctors and healthcare professionals. And they have a professor of professionalism. So just think about that as a new career for somebody. Nick Vineall needs no introduction, I suspect, to most, if not all, members of this audience, as chair of the Bar Council of England and Wales. He practices probably not very much this year, I imagine, in commercial construction and financial services law, but he needs a plug just so that people don't forget that, and has sat as a Deputy High Court judge doing TCC and commercial court cases. He used to chair the Bar Council Education and Training Committee and chaired a regulatory review working group last year. He's a bencher of another inn, a good one, Middle Temple, and many would say he still qualifies for the role he had in 1994 when he was chair of the Young Bar. So Nick Vineall.
Flattery will get you everywhere, however unlikely its substance. Thank you. I just wanted to say a few words from the perspective of the bar on professionalism and values. I think a key element of professionalism is personal obligations and personal duties. I actually sometimes struggle a bit to think how one would transpose duties of professionalism to corporate professional bodies. I think that can be quite tricky, but I think at any rate at the bar we're okay because we can focus on the fact that we always individually owe duties to our clients to comply with the professional principles. And we are fortunate that we have an Act of Parliament which tells us, at least at a high level, what they are. So I can deal in a sense with what the professional principles are quite quickly. Those of you familiar with the Legal Services Act will know that the regulators, when they exercise regulatory functions, must have regard to the regulatory objectives. That's for the regulators. One of those regulatory objectives is that they must promote compliance with the professional principles with which all barristers and solicitors and legal executives must comply, and they are as follows: that authorised persons should act with independence and integrity. And I suspect actually, in a sense, that is the key one to capture the absolute essence of professionalism. So we must act with independence and integrity. We should maintain proper standards of work. Well, everybody should do that, whether they're professional or not. So I don't think that's so unique to professions. That we should act in the best interests of our clients, and I'll come back to the problems that causes, but we have to act in the best interests of their clients, but also, if, like barristers, we exercise rights of audience, we must also comply with our duty to the court to act with independence in the interests of justice. And you can already see where the difficulties arise, and we all know as barristers where some of the difficulties arise. And finally, we must keep the affairs of clients confidential. I think it's important to make the point that what the regulators do, the Bar Council is the approved regulator, but it delegates that regulatory role to the Bar Standards Board, because we also have a representative role. But what the approved regulators must do, however they do it, is set standards, but they are minimum standards. And I think it's quite important for the Bar to remember that although the standards set by the Code of Conduct are high, they are nevertheless minimum standards. And I've been very much affected by this year, by that difference in a way, because one of the, I think, challenges for the BSB, which I have to say I think they've got right, is setting guidance for use of social media and barristers sounding off on Twitter about other barristers or about this, that, and the other. And it's raises some quite difficult questions about balancing people's freedom of expression rights with their professional obligations. And the BSB has given some guidance about that, and I'm probably not supposed even to comment on it, but personally I think it's in the right place. But, and it's a really big but, there are some members of the profession who post some things on social media which I believe are not breaching those minimum standards of conduct, but which are profoundly unprofessional, deeply unkind, deeply ill-judged, and I would characterise as being unprofessional, even if they don't necessarily breach the Code of Conduct provisions. And I think as professions we have to remember that we should hold ourselves to the highest standards if we are to maintain trust and confidence, and our regulators very properly impose standards which are the baseline, which you go below at your peril. But I'm always keen to make the point that I think there's a higher standard which we should impose on ourselves. Now, in relation to trust and likability of the professions, we don't do massively well. But I think, actually, there's quite a good reason, or at least an understandable reason, why we don't always do so well. I don't think we're ever going to be as popular as nurses or doctors. And why? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? Because lots of times you are seeing a barrister who is acting against your interests. He or she is acting for your counterparty. And if they do that particularly well, you may not take too kindly to that. You don't often see doctors or nurses in action who are doing something which is contrary to your own interests. And even just dealing with the relationship between the client and their own barrister. Sometimes barristers have to be the bearer of profoundly ill-received and unattractive news, like, your case is hopeless, you ought to drop it. And that's not always endearing to the client. And even worse than that, sometimes your barrister has to tell you to do something which is flatly contrary to your own interests. For instance, you must disclose document 234 of Bundle B, even though it will mean your case becomes hopeless when the other side sees it. And that is even less endearing to the client than simply telling them their case is not very good. So I think the desire always to be popular as a professional person, always to be liked by your client, to be popular with your client, is a mistake. It is not that we should be aiming for. And so I am not too disappointed by the fact that we're not liked, and I suspect liked and trusted are quite similar, that we're not as popular as some of the other professions, because I don't think there are obvious analogies with the position where you have a professional person and they're, in fact, forced to act against your own interest. There is, I think, for all of us a challenge which comes from the risk of confusion of barristers with their clients. And we've seen it this year. The point is that you can be a good person, good professional person, who is acting for a bad person. You can be a good lawyer, and by that I mean a morally good lawyer as well as a competent lawyer. You can be a good lawyer acting for a profoundly bad person. And that is a fundamental point which is, I think, sometimes misunderstood, and I was very pleased in the summer to be able jointly with the Law Society to put out a statement criticising the wholly unjustified criticism of Jacqueline Mackenzie, a very distinguished asylum practitioner, a solicitor who did asylum work, who was criticised apparently simply because some people thought she was doing her job too effectively, and that's just completely unacceptable. But I have to say I was troubled to receive a letter from the LSB which said that it disagreed with the Bar Council's view that the only test of a lawyer's conduct is whether the lawyer's conduct is lawful. And I was so disappointed to receive that letter because, of course, our position is not that the only test of a lawyer's conduct is whether the lawyer's conduct is lawful. The test of a lawyer's conduct goes back to the professional principles and is a much, much higher test. But actually, I think the confusion is symptomatic of a wider confusion about this distinction, sometimes quite difficult to make, between our duties and conduct obligations and the obligations of our clients. And I think our clients' obligations are essentially just to comply with the law. And where you see this working itself out is in the question of what do we do when a client comes to us? And I think at a high level there are three possibilities. One is you have to take a client and his or her case, irrespective of your views of the client. A positive duty not to judge the client. That's one possibility. There's a second possibility, which is you can judge the potential client if you want to, but you don't have to. And there's a third possibility on that spectrum, which is that you are under some type of duty to pass judgment on your client, which goes beyond asking whether they're asking you to do something which is unlawful, help them to do something which is unlawful. The first of those possibilities, that there is in a sense a positive duty not to judge, you are precluded from judging, is the cab rank rule. And that's the rule which applies to our profession, and I think it's right for us. The intermediate position is the position which applies to solicitors. Solicitors do not have the cab rank rule. It is permissible for a solicitor to say, I choose not to act for businesses whom I regard as polluters. That's permissible if you're a solicitor. The third position, that you're under some type of duty to pass judgment on your client, is one which I think is being advocated by some who say that lawyers have a role as gatekeepers in some sense, and that position is one with which I profoundly disagree. I think it is perfectly proper to act for people of whom you disapprove, And personally, I am proud that in our profession, we have a duty to act for people with whom we disagree and of whom we disapprove. But that is quite a topical issue, and there's one feature of it which I think needs more exploration, because I've realised over this year, as I've been promoting this point of view, that, of course, I think of a lawyer, because I'm a barrister, as being involved in contentious disputes, dealing with people who wish to either vindicate or defend their legal rights. And that's my paradigm job that I've done for 30-odd years. And in a sense, I think that's one end of a spectrum of things that lawyers do. And right at the other end of the spectrum is what I would call purely transactional work. And it is a spectrum with, I think, advisory work in the middle. And I've been thinking about the lawyer, probably not a barrister, but the lawyer who has a client come along who says, what I'd like to do, I've got quite a lot of money sitting in my bank account in London, but what I'd like to do is move it into an offshore account held by a Cook Island partnership in trust, and the trust will be a Liechtenstein Anstalt, and the trustees will be corporate trustees in the British Virgin Islands. Would you do that for me, please? And I am not at all persuaded that anything like a cab rank rule ought to apply to that kind of transactional work, or at least I'm not persuaded that for every professional lawyer there ought to be a compulsion to do that sort of work. And I think there is something different about lawyers when they're acting for people who want to resolve disputes or to vindicate or defend their rights, and perhaps some things at the other end of that range. But I think we perhaps, all the professions, all the legal professions, maybe need to think a little bit more about that. But personally, I think that the cab rank rule is good for us as a profession. So, in short, there is distrust or suspicion of lawyers, I'm afraid. I think we need to try harder to explain what we do and why, but we shouldn't fall into the trap of necessarily always wanting to be liked by everybody, because that's not what professionals do.
Well, thank you very much for those thought-provoking remarks, Nick. One thing I might comment on is, in terms of the cab rank rule and medicine, of course, doctors do have something similar in that you, on the whole, I don't think, Jane, do you discriminate between your patients because you don't like them or you think they're rather bad people when it comes to whether you provide them with treatment or not. No doubt if you did, you wouldn't treat anybody, so it would be there'd be something wrong with them, wouldn't there? But I think the mission to explain, I think, is something that we could all learn a bit from. So our next speaker is Sir David Behan, who was, last time I spoke to him, he was chair of Health Education England, but in the inimitable way of the NHS, his organisation has been reorganised and merged into NHS England. Don't ask me why or what. As a result of which he is now, I believe, the Group Non-Executive Director and Chair of the Workforce Training and Education Committee, which I think actually has the same job as Health Education England had. But watch this space. So he's the chief man in relation to the training of the NHS workforce, which is, needless to say, a huge job. But he's a sucker for punishment because before that he was if I may say so, transformative chief executive of the Care Quality Commission, the system regulator for health and social care providers. And before that, he was a Director General for Social Care in the Department of Health and Social Care. Before that, at the beginning of his career, he started as a social worker. He rose to be Director of Social Services in a number of different places, including Cleveland, shortly after the child care scandal there. He also was the first Chief Inspector of what was then the Commission for Social Care Inspection. and he's been president of the Association of Directors of Social Services. So he covers a broad range of professions, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say. David.
Thank you, Robert. Good evening, everybody. And Robert, thank you very much for the opportunity to share some reflections. I blame social media, the fact that he can get all that information and share it with you. And I'm going to just explore that as well. So what I've prepared is, what does it mean to be a professional in the middle of the 21st century? So these are some personal reflections. I'll share with you some reflections based on my own experience. Robert's covered some of the jobs that I've held. I then want to turn to some wider societal changes which set the context within which we're having this conversation this evening, and then just a very few reflections on what we as professionals might do. But I want to begin in 1972 when, as a sixth former, I volunteered to work with single homeless people in Blackburn, my hometown. And that for me was the beginning of a lifelong commitment to want to make a contribution to a more socially just society. This motivation has been the golden thread through my career, my personal purpose, if you wish, my vocation, I choose that word advisedly, in whatever role I've occupied. And after university, I began to work as a newly qualified social worker in 1978 in one of the newly created Seabourn Social Services departments. It was a time of great hope and optimism about the potential for what the nascent profession of social work could achieve. But in my 25 years working in local authority social services departments, I saw that optimism decline as trust and confidence in social work eroded. There are many reasons for this, but the economic recessions through the 80s, 90s and noughties undoubtedly played a part as local government was hollowed out. But so did the child abuse scandals of that period. The inquiries that followed the deaths of several children were high profile, shocked society as the professions that were tasked with protecting these children were seen to fail. The trust in the professions was breached. Victoria Climbier, Kimberly Carlisle, Jasmine Beckford, more recently Peter Connolly, to name just four, became household names through their deaths and the subsequent inquiries. Indeed, as Robert has said, my own career was directly shaped by both these events. And when I joined Cleveland Social Services Departments in 1989, in the immediate aftermath of Lord Justice Butler Schloss's inquiry report. But it was the inquiry into the death of Victoria Climbier in 2000 that led to the establishment of the General Social Care Council as a professional body for the regulation of social workers. Until this date, social work was not a regulated profession. And it's now on its third incarnation of professional regulators. The General Social Care Council was succeeded by the Health and Care Professions Council, which in turn has been succeeded by Social Work England. The JMC has existed for over 150 years, I think, and we're now on a third incarnation of the social work regulator inside 20 years. A reflection, perhaps, of the limits of professional regulation. In reflecting on these tragic deaths described in these inquiry reports, I'm personally struck by how far it was the trust and confidence in social work that was damaged, much more than the trust and confidence in nursing, medicine or teaching. Yet all these professions were criticised and held to account in these inquiry reports for the failures. And when preparing these few thoughts, I reviewed the codes of conduct for solicitors, teachers, doctors, nurses, social workers, care workers, and was struck not by their differences, but by their similarities. I want now to reflect on my 9 years leading health and care regulation as Chief Inspector at the Commission for Social Care Inspection and then as Chief Executive of the Care Quality Commission. And during that time, I reflected on whether the health and care system was a self-regulating system, one that naturally learns and improves. Indeed, one within which the themselves learn and improve? Sadly, I'm not convinced. In 2015, Dr. Bill Kirkup published his report on maternity services at University Hospital Morecambe Bay. 7 years later, in 2022, he published a report on maternity services in East Kent NHS Trust. And these reports sit alongside the report by Donna Ockenden into maternity services at Shrewsbury and Telford. And these reports broadly tell the same tale about the way that patients and their families were treated, about the culture in those organisations, and sadly, the behaviours of some professionals, which I don't know about you, but I regarded as entirely inconsistent with the behaviours set out in their codes of practice. They also raise the issue, as do the inquiries into children's safeguarding, of how learning does or does not take place. I completely agree, Nick, with your point about the personal responsibilities that sit with us as registered professionals as being a key driver. And I do ask the question, what is the personal as well as the professional responsibility of professionals to adopt the lessons of these inquiry reports in their own practice, whatever their employer does? The Bristol Inquiry report by Sir Ian Kennedy in 2001 raised similar issues. And I recall vividly meeting some of the families from the Bristol Inquiry report, and also meeting some of the families from Morecambe Bay. And what was common between their descriptions of how they felt they'd been treated by the professions was they felt betrayed and they felt angry that they'd been lied to. And they used those words advisedly. And in contrast, there are professionals who feel that their professional standards, particularly in respect of safety, are being compromised by a colleague or colleagues or by their employer or by the system that they work in. And they are frustrated at getting their voice and their concerns heard. They feel they have no alternative but to blow the whistle. And as an aside, I understand that referrals to the NMC since the Lucy Letby case have increased dramatically. I do, Robert, pay tribute to your expertise and your work in this area and shining a light on this fundamental issue. Listening not only to the families, but now to several whistleblowers, as they describe their experience, what is clear is the great personal cost to them of taking action, being sent to Coventry, the code of omerta as they experience from their colleagues. And again, I reflect on how consistent is this with the codes of practice of those professions. So I want to turn now to explore some of the issues of the wider societal changes which may be influencing these issues. But before that, I just want to delve back into the history of modern professions. And I do this advisedly because the title that I set was what it means to be a professional in the middle of the 21st century. But I want to go back into the middle of the 20th century, because earlier this year we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the NHS. Less heralded, but of a similar significance, was the 1948 National Assistance Act, which shaped the social care system that we have today. And along with the Education Acts that were passed slightly earlier, these pieces of seminal legislation were part of the creation of the welfare state in that immediate post-war settlement. Attlee, Bevan are all well known for their outstanding contributions to the creation of the NHS and the wider welfare state. Perhaps less well known is the work of Sir William Beveridge, the civil servant who in 1941 was asked to chair a committee on social insurance. His report, Social Insurance and the Allied Services, was published in 1942 and provided the basis for many of the reforms that led to what we now understand as the welfare state. It was, and this is my key point this evening, colleagues, a social contract between the state and the individual. it explicitly and intentionally set out what the deal was between the state and the individuals in society. But I want to argue that the social contract responded to the needs of the early and middle 20th century. The response was overwhelmingly favourable to the establishment of the NHS and the welfare state, and it's undoubtedly transformed the lives of every generation since it was founded. However, as we enter the middle of the 21st century, the social contract requires renewal. Many people feel that the social contract today is not working for them, that the system is not working in their interests. Here in the UK, I believe society is becoming more uncertain, more complicated, more complex. We are grappling with the challenges of demography, science, technology, climate change, while society becomes more divided and more polarised. Unlike the middle of the 20th century, trust in politics, the professions and institutions is much lower than in the middle. Now we are approaching the middle of the 21st century. And to illustrate, Robert's already used a slide of the 2022 Ipsos Mori survey on trust in professions. But I want to draw not to where the professions stand in the league tables. The point I want to make from that is to compare the 2022 survey with the 2021 survey. And this is a survey that has been repeated every year for the past 22 years, I believe. And it's that trend that I want to pick up on. And trust in politicians fell by 7% from 2021 to 2022, which is why it stands at 12% today. As Robert indicated, the top 6 most trusted professions are nurses, engineers, doctors, scientists, teachers and museum curators. Interestingly, how they've got in there. Perhaps they might give the Elgin Marbles back. But whilst doctors and nurses are amongst the most trusted, they too have fallen from their 2021 score. Trust in nurses fell by 5% to 89%, and trust in doctors fell by 6% to 85%. Incidentally, coming from my area, care home workers were in that list at 9th on 76%, which I think is interesting. And I want to argue that it is not only trust that is being eroded, as over my lifetime, I've seen the erosion of deference as well. And I think these two in combination, the erosion of trust and deference, need to be considered together. I haven't got time to dive into that. But I want to raise the issue of, as well, of our understanding of intergenerational attitudes, the difference between baby boomers, millennials and Generation Z. I personally do not think we should underestimate these trends and their implications. Another area which is relevant in my view is the different generational attitudes towards work. Baby boomers, I'm one of them, are much more likely to talk about vocation, and the younger generations, Generation Z, more than millennials, but nevertheless some millennials are much more likely to talk about a job. Not a vocation. Indeed, they're even less likely to talk about a career than we, as their parents, will do. Without going too deeply into the psychopathology of some of this, I also want to argue that the psychological and emotional contract between professions and the public is also being eroded. I do worry that one of the implications of the current industrial action by doctors is an erosion of that psychological and emotional contract between the people that provide care and the people that receive care. But why are these trends developing? In my view, the rise of social media has contributed. It's changed where many, particularly younger people, to make that point about intergenerational attitudes, get their news. It's led to an escalation of fake news and alternative perspective, whether supported by the evidence or otherwise. The philosopher Anura O'Neill, in her 2002 Reith lecture, which is pre-social media, described in a paraphrase, deception as the enemy of trust. and singled out people who deliberately mislead. She could have been describing the fake news of today. And whilst the social media campaigns by anti-vaxxers was a challenge to professions during the pandemic, as Chris Whitty set out in his evidence last week to the COVID inquiry, the scientists behind the Great Barrington Declaration were just wrong. Andrew Wakefield was eventually challenged about his reviews on MMR vaccines, and his legacy continues as the hesitancy and refusal of parents to vaccinate their children is seeing the illnesses of measles, mumps and rubella begin to recur, something I thought had been expunged when my generation were vaccinated. To complicate the situation even more, there's evidence from geopolitics of deliberate attempts by state actors to spread disinformation and undermine the social order of Western democracies. I did not think I could reflect on a profession, on professions without touching on power. Who holds it and how is it distributed? The internet has, in my view, democratised access to knowledge. It has shifted the balance of power towards the public as consumers of knowledge, of education and of evidence. I think this is a good thing overall, but it has also changed the nature of the relationship between professions and the public. And I think, continuing the geopolitical theme, globally the rise of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, is shifting the balance of power and influence from the established order created after the Second World War. This makes the world order even more uncertain, more unpredictable. And this is not only the challenge for our politicians, but I also think for many of us. So what are we going to do about all of this? Robert asked the question in the briefings that came out to us, what can the professions do individually and collectively to enhance the public understanding and acceptance of their public value? And I do think there's an important task for all of us as professionals. The health profession remains amongst the most trusted in the UK. I think we've prosecuted that argument successfully this evening. But I want to argue that they have a responsibility to understand how the context that they're practicing is changing and lead their professions to embrace that change. Whether Elon Musk is correct in his assertion that in future people will choose whether they work or not, I feel sure that the advances in science and technology generally, and AI in particular, will have a profound change on the professions of the future. Traditionally, professions have resisted what they perceive to be threats to their role and purpose. Is there an opportunity to define a future which is different to the past and the present, but one in which the values that are set out in those codes of practice, and indeed in the Nolan principles of public life, continue to be definitive? Put another way, can the professions invent their future? I do believe that the vision for the future needs to be intrinsic to the professions. Extrinsic drivers will be present in the future as they are now, but real and sustainable change must be driven by the professions themselves. Thank you very much for listening.
Well, that is a formidable task. Thank you very much, David. Can I now introduce Alan Kershaw, who is something of a professional regulation specialist. In fact, he can bring to us the perspective of a frankly incredible number of professions from him for the price of one. He currently chairs our very own super regulator, the Legal Services Board, but also the Architects Registration Board. He also chairs, I believe, the National Register of Public Service Interpreters. He was a lay member of the original Solicitors Regulation Authority, and more recently served as a member of the Intellectual Property Regulation Board and the Admissions and Licensing Committee of SILEX. Before that, I met him as Director of Education and Standards at the General Medical Council, and, I'm running out of breath, the Chief Executive of the Council for Registration of Forensic Practitioners, and he sat on the board of the regulatory boards of the General Pharmaceutical Council and the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. So, Alan, with that introduction, I don't know which of those professions you're going to talk about, but we'll.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. I must say I didn't know most of that about me, so I'm grateful that you found it all out. It's got to the age where I've forgotten most of what I've done, I guess. But what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about regulation. And I'm rather glad that regulators don't appear in the Murray poll, because it's one of those things that if somebody asks you at a party what you do, it stops the conversation in one. Until you start telling the stories, and then it starts getting very interesting indeed. Far more. Robert, you and I go back a long way, at least the closing years of the last century, as you alluded, when we were actually near neighbours in Surrey, and were both involved in different ways, different roles, with some disciplinary cases at the General Medical Council, not least one rather big one. And here we are, still in the thick of the world of professional standards and standard setting. Echoing Jane, who started off with this point, it was W.H. Auden who said, "When I find myself in the company of scientists, I feel like a shabby curate who's strayed by mistake into a drawing room full of dukes." And I suppose I might have felt something similar tonight, but I just see a few not unfriendly faces. So while I might have said rather nervously that some of my best friends are barristers, I think tonight I can safely say that some of the best barristers are my friends. You invite us to address the question, have we, if you're not nice to me now, I don't know what will get me. People cross the road to avoid their regulator. You invite us to address the question, have we had enough of experts? And you link that question to the opprobrium directed at professionals of all kinds, but in particular at lawyers, when they simply do their job, when they interpret laws written by the people who are criticising them. It's a connection very well made, and before I get into the substance of any argument, let me say how strongly we at the LSB reject divisive language such as activist, lefty lawyer, do-gooder, wokerati. Goodness, how quickly a word becomes an antique, even ones that aren't even English. Even worse, enemies of the people, and probably less repeatable terms. I hope to show why this is wrong and indeed dangerous. I'm not sure I need to echo very much of what's been said already on that front. Now, I have the fortune, perhaps the misfortune, to have worked essentially as a regulator for 40 years now with a range of professional groups, indeed all the ones represented by my distinguished colleagues this evening. I will do my best not to repeat what they say, but it would be surprising if some themes didn't come through in each way. Professional regulation was helpfully described by the Merison Committee, inquiring into the regulation of the medical profession in 1975, as a contract between the profession and the public, as a deal, in other words, in which the public allows a profession to set and, along with lay members, police its standards in return for an assurance that that regulation, properly applied, will secure the standards of competence and conduct and ethics which the public has a right to expect. In other words, society has effectively delegated, and in some cases restricted, expert knowledge and skills to define groups of professionals in which the public is invited to place its trust. You've heard that word a lot this evening, and you'll hear a lot more from me. It was everything in regulation, in standard setting, flows from trust. Every code of conduct could be reduced to those 5 letters, and what flows from them. The doctor, the nurse, the solicitor, the legal executive, the barrister, the architect, the pharmacist, and others. I counted the groups I've been involved with, and I lost the will to live. It's a deal, a contract which, when it works effectively and freely entered into, as it has been, has profound benefits for both sides. Trust is obviously essential to the functioning of a well-ordered society, and it's at the heart of the relationship, a surprisingly intimate one in many cases, well beyond healthcare, but an intimate relationship of sharing of secrets and hopes and dreams and aspirations and all the other things that we talk to our professionals about. That will apply to lawyers as well in many ways. That relationship between a professional and their client, their patient, their customer. And that trust is being actively undermined by some, and in ways that are blind to the centrality of independent, liberal professions to a civilised way of life. I think that's at the heart of Sir Robert's exam question for this evening. Have we had enough of experts answer in no more than 500 words, trying to avoid the words rubbish, piffle and trite. That's given my answer to the question. I haven't even said the word no. However, I'm not going to major on the broader erosion of trust across society. That would be a political question that's above the pay grade even of the LSB. What I am going to say more about is how that trust is built in the first place. In times past, trust was demanded from a largely deferential public, characterised by huge inequalities of education and information. We just heard about the power imbalance. It still exists. It needs to be corrected in many ways, but only in healthy ways. A leading motto in those times might have been, trust me, I'm a, delete as appropriate, doctor, barrister, even, dare I say it, MP. My parents would have used the phrase doctor's orders. Few people nowadays use such a term. In the era of social media, self-diagnosis, the enormous democratization of knowledge brought by the internet, not at all a bad thing, not to mention the emerging implications of AI, and who knows where that's going. Professionals are routinely challenged, and trust needs as never before to be earned, not demanded. The doctor will tell you they often confronted by a patient who knows more about the condition than they do themselves, because they've been to the internet and researched 20 papers, and the GP is trying to learn less and less about more and more. The earning and maintenance of public trust must therefore be at the heart of any modern system of independent public interest regulation. And because regulators acting purely on their own are actually quite limited in what they can achieve, it's taken me 40 years to learn that, but it is actually true. The best systems of regulation involve a partnership between regulator and profession. What form should that partnership take? And this is where I might talk about, I haven't listed the things that can be done, but it's in that kind of territory that I think the work can be done of rebuilding confidence in professions. And no established profession worth its salt needs a regulator to tell it that it needs to act according to an ethical code, that it needs inspirational and motivational leadership to encourage all its members to live and breathe that code, that being part of a profession is more than just a job, that there is some underlying purpose that comes with both privileges and obligations to society broadly. That notion that one's occupation is more than a job is one that I've always felt should be a source of great and justifiable pride and joy. And it's that pride and joy which ought to be capable of doing much more of the heavy lifting in the business of building and retaining trust. Peer group pressure and effective role modelling, especially when you're learning, are at least as effective as precept and private study. The regulatory arm of a profession, singing in harmony, if not necessarily always in unison, with professional leadership bodies, can achieve a great deal more than a regulator sitting at the top of a mountain, rolling down decrees that it hopes will be picked up by the regulated community, which will normally in the end do more or less what the regulator demands, but through gritted teeth and learning very rapidly how to play the system. Trust me, I've seen it done. Yeah, trust me, I'm a regulator, that's fine. What the regulator can be is the prism through which the demands of public trust can be refined into the professional behaviours that generate and nurture trust. Regulation can and must, and sadly has to, hold up a mirror to the professions to help build the genuine, selfless objectivity that's needed to do the right thing by society, but which can be surprisingly difficult, some might say impossible, to deliver purely from within the professions themselves. Having the mirror held up can result in discomfort, of course. I don't much enjoy looking in a mirror, and I don't imagine anyone else does. Very recent research carried out for the Solicitors Regulation Authority found significant discrepancies between how solicitors viewed themselves and their services and how users viewed them. Perhaps not surprisingly, solicitors tended to perceive their services as being of significantly higher quality and value for money than did consumers. What a good example to use in an audience of barristers. What solicitors thought, while they thought they understood client situations and needs, the researchers found that many clients, this is how I think I'm quoting here, many clients themselves perceive a lack of understanding and empathy on the part of legal service providers. I could go on. That's why at the Legal Services Board we have not shied away from highlighting key issues that, addressed by the frontline regulators themselves, Bar Council, Law Society and so on, will build trust, but left unaddressed will tend to erode it, to the detriment probably more of the profession than the public. We highlighted weaknesses in systems for ensuring competence throughout a professional's career and the need to do something about it. The regulators we oversee have seen the value of modernising the way they monitor lawyers' continuing professional development activity, recognising that most professionals, most of the time, are decent individuals trying to do the right thing. You could easily think a regulator would have the opposite view. In fact, we see how rare it is for people to fall badly out of line. Are most likely doing far more CPD than their regulator ever requires, just not necessarily calling it CPD or identifying its benefits. We've been highlighting the gaps between the principles of ethics and their practical outworkings and the many ways those gaps can harm the public, from over-aggressive litigation designed, let's not mince words, to intimidate and deny justice, to badly crafted legal instruments designed to silence victims of misconduct. We've highlighted the barriers that can be put in the way of people who want to use legal services and the responsibility and the many opportunities the professions have to break those barriers down. We're highlighting the fundamental role of lawyers in making it harder for criminals to pursue economic crime by leaning on the UK's hard-fought reputation as a jurisdiction of law and fairness. Almost inevitably, shining lights like that can produce a discomfort that readily leads to defensiveness. No one likes looking in the mirror, as I said, especially when someone else is holding it. But a regulator sometimes has the uncomfortable duty of telling a profession what it looks like or is about to look like. And here, with permission, I'll just depart from my immediate thing to respond to a point made by Nick a few moments ago, who's a good friend of mine, I have to say. And I have to say, first of all, Nick, you have no monopoly on receiving letters that contain an element of disappointment. Secondly, it would be helpful if the Bar Council could find a way of communicating to their members that it's not their position that anything is lawful if it's not prohibited by law, because that precise position was taken by a distinguished barrister at a seminar on slaps, attended by one of my LSB colleagues only a couple of days ago. What do professionals sometimes look like? An us and them between regulator and profession, where the profession dismisses the regulator's concerns as unwarranted or out of scope or otherwise misplaced, is not conducive to high standards, and a regulator is inevitably frustrated when the collaboration they seek in pursuit of mutual objectives is not offered, so that more interventionist approaches may have to be contemplated. Anyone who spent any time around my organisation at the LSB would recognise that narrative. But I think that's itself is a mistake. Done well with reciprocation and respect, regulation is a public good, benefiting a profession just as much, some might even say more than it benefits the public. Perhaps even more when you consider that in the absence of an effective system of regulation, you'd be lucky to get more than the Wild West. Partnership between regulator and profession is fundamental to raising standards, and on the shoulders of that, nurturing public trust. I would say that regulation, like Guinness, is an acquired taste, but it's certainly good for you. And this brings me full circle to the opening question. Have we had enough of experts? The unwholesome criticism of lawyers resonates also in recent criticism of doctors, scientists, economics, indeed anyone who says something that someone prominent finds inconvenient. Is the ball too difficult? Play the man or the woman. Hope that by this time tomorrow it will have slipped down the news agenda, which most things do. It's my contention that the world is more in need of professionals and the expertise they offer than ever before. But with the disappearance of the deference mode, the model of trust, a reliance on external assurance and credibility, the role played by modern regulation is of fundamental importance. And I think that will mean, certainly in the legal sector, an acceptance that regulation is not simply an unwelcome burden, just a cost of doing business that must be borne and reduced to the minimum that can be got away with. but that regulation, well conceived and well delivered, is an effective proxy for public trust. The regulator, in other words, is acting as society's agent in ensuring that professions fulfil their societal obligations, built on that foundation of trust and moving outwards from it, in return for the many privileges that you, are allowed to enjoy. In summary, and I'm finishing now, society will trust you to guide your clients through technical areas where most of us won't go or can't go. We'll trust you to have the right knowledge, skills, attitudes, and behaviours. We'll trust you to treat us fairly. We'll trust you to communicate with us, to tell us the truth, indeed to have a passion for the truth at all times. We will trust you not to cheat us, and to think beyond immediate parameters and not just follow the instructions on the box. This is a profession, not a trade. We will trust you to solve the problems and be determined to get things right, and trust you to go on learning, be you never so knowledgeable, never so experienced, never so grand. In short, your clients will trust you not to let you down. I'm sure this is your day-to-day experience in many cases, so I doubt I have to say this to you, but it is about that trust. The challenge to regulators and to professional leaders is to go on helping good lawyers to be the best they can be, and I trust that it's only for that positive reason that anyone in this room will ever have to have dealings with their regulator. I'll leave it there.
It's now time for you lot to have a say. Just one ground rule, which is, can you wait till the microphone comes to you? And this gentleman here, and could you identify who you are as well, for the benefit of those online?
Mangal Kapoor, I have a question for Dame Jane Baker on the subject of have we had enough of experts. Do you think there may be a danger in trials where experts are giving evidence against doctors, there are obviously other doctors, that hard-pressed doctors in chaotic wards are being held to an unrealistic and unattainable standard of perfection? I'm thinking a bit of the case of Sellu, overturned by the Court of Appeal, where the jury were told they can now ignore expert opinion, where a surgeon had been sent to prison for 2.5 years. Not my branch of law, but I just thought I'd do a little bit of research, as this is the question tonight. But I thought it was an interesting question for you. I'm not making any speech as Treasurer, so I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Can I give an even shorter answer? Yes. The answer is there is a problem. The problem needs to be reviewed and looked at, and the standards and professionalism of those professional experts also, I think, should be called into question, because there is no single registry and there is no standard that is set for those people. And it's been very, very difficult to get agreement on how that might happen. So you often have the case where the expert is, as you say, somebody who works at a completely different level, in a completely different environment, and does not understand the context within which the doctor accused has been working. So that became a really big deal with the case of Hadiza Bawagaba, where she was working under impossible circumstances, and yet her professionalism was called into question, and she was struck off by the regulator. So there, I think, is a problem with the experts that are being used by you guys.
David, did you want to add anything to that? No, you were very wise. At the back there, please. Keep Henrietta fit.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Davis. I'm a barrister practicing in family law. This isn't really for anyone specifically, but I wondered what the panel think about the role of diversity in this. Firstly, with people's perception of being told something by people who might not look like them or been through their own experiences. And secondly, inwardly, the lack of diversity within certain professions, the ability to adapt how they communicate what they do. To make people understand. For example, publishing something in The Guardian might not get the attention of the public the way a short, sharp tweet would, explaining what we do. And I just wondered if the panel had any thoughts on that.
Nick?
I suppose this comes back to this theme which was emerging about the disappearance, and I would say the disappearance, thank goodness, of deference, of some type of automatic deference, and replacing it with trust. I think we all need, I think everybody feels that the touchstone of everything in the professions ought to be merit and only merit, and that the closer we get to achieving merit, the closer we will get to diverse professions which more easily gain the trust of those they serve.
Jane?
I think there are problems with diversity. When the COVID vaccination programme was being rolled out, there was far less uptake of COVID vaccination in people from minority ethnic groups, and that was because the people that were advising them and that were giving the vaccinations were from groups. Okay, they were of professionals, but they were people who were not like them and who were not trusted in the same way as their own minority groups would have been trusted. There's also a problem, for example, in engagement with medical research, and I think there is a big problem within the professions of diversity, and I think we ignore it at our peril.
Alan?
Yes, thank you. I mean, Jane makes the point more powerfully than I could about the actual practical effects that actually working for a greater diversity and inclusion. That, in fact, is one of the regulatory objectives Nick referred to, an inclusive profession. Actually, it's not just a good thing, but it actually getting it wrong can have dramatically adverse effects for people, which will cause epidemics sooner or later. That's a bad thing in itself. It's naturally, but the most important thing to me is that the professional should be personable, should listen, should be able to relate to the person and win their trust. I think that's a great deal easier if you have an inclusive profession which has a range. I wouldn't like to say that if you're from one ethnic group, you should only go to a doctor or a lawyer or whatever of that ethnic group, but it certainly helps to see that group is made up that way. I do want to applaud what all the frontline regulators are doing, and indeed the Judicial Appointments Commission, to try and get this right. It is an extraordinary struggle, and I don't want to excuse anything because it's been very slow. When you hear the lived experience of people who've actually suffered, and let's talk about disability as well as everything else. All the more the other visible minority groups. There is so much more that needs to be done. There is a relatively limited amount you can achieve by standing at the top of the steps and haranguing people. However, we've got to find smart ways of getting this right, and we certainly at the LSB we have convening power, we have persuasive power. This is not one where enforcing is necessarily going to get anything right. However, it has to be. We need a step change here, and it has to be more about actually seeing change, making change happen, than talking about it. I'm afraid there are still too many people in the world who want to see change, as long as it doesn't make any difference.
David?
Rebecca, thanks. Look, I think this is really tricky, but I'll say three things. Firstly, I think one of the aspects in my mind that defines a profession, I'm not sure, Nick, whether you were getting at this as well, is what are the personal qualities. And I think the ability for a professional to see an issue through the eyes of somebody else and not just through their own eyes is a key trait, a key characteristic of being a professional. Others will call it emotional intelligence. You can call it what you wish, but I think it's key. Alan's already made reference to it, the ability to listen intently and empathetically to the people that you are working with strikes me as being absolutely crucial. But you use the phrase, can people see themselves in the organisations, in the services, in the systems? And I think public services generally have done pretty well on this. But we are challenged. If you look at the health service or social care and local governments, then the proportion of people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds in the workforce is significant, and it's probably higher than the national average, maybe not in some communities, but higher than the national average. But when you then begin to look at the more senior roles in those professions, then people are just not represented in the same way. So I think we've still got a lot of work to do to actually ensure that there is a trajectory that is taking people from different backgrounds into those senior positions. And I think it will be only when we get to the point where people can see themselves in those organisations that I think we'll begin to make more progress than we have done. And then the third thing, if I may, Robert, say is I do think some of the changes that have taken place in education, and this is where the professions come in. One of my questions as I go around the universities looking at medical and nursing education is, what are the universities doing to actually widen participation and promote different routes into those professions from people from different backgrounds? And I have to say, I visit some medical schools and say, yeah, we do widen participation. And my next question is, do you require chemistry as an A-level entry into medical profession? To which they say yes. Well, I have to say, I had a pretty mixed education for a variety of different reasons. The secondary school I went to didn't do chemistry. So I think we've got a long way to go to actually give meaning through our actions to some of the words that we're using about widening participation and promoting social mobility. So I think apprenticeship routes into medicine is a good thing. It's going to have a tricky ride as that's introduced. I'm already accused of watering down medicine. I don't know what the legal profession is doing to widen routes and participation into law courses, but you know, whoever's doing that, they'll get accused of watering down the profession. So I think we've got a lot still to do. You ask a very simple question that's got a lot of nooks and crannies that need unpicking, I think.
Well, thank you very much for the answers and indeed the question. The online audience is waking up at last, and I'm going to paraphrase this question because it would take too long to read the entire answer, but I hope the questioner won't mind. It's basically this: to quote the final speaker, "Profession is not a trade." That is, in effect, challenged. Is there really a difference? Don't we need regulators for trades, you know, who are serving the people, really? Shouldn't there be transparency and public accountability? Even vocations like the church, who's regulating them? So what is the difference between a trade? Is there really, in modern times, I think I could paraphrase this, between a profession and an occupation? So who would like to take up that challenge?
Well,
Go on, Alan.
Having started this hair running.
The other thing, could you use the microphone, because I'm having a complaint online that
I'm so sorry.
always help.
I thought it was picking it up. I mean, having started this hair running and catching myself halfway through saying it, thinking what a patronising thing it is to say that, you know, somehow this is first class and trades are second class. I'm simply saying the difference between occupations where you have to think long ways outside the box and relate one thing to another, with those where there is effectively a manual which tells you what to do next. And you know, the distinction, I agree with the question, very, very blurred, I think. And in fact, in different countries, there's different ways. I heard once, I'm not sure whether it's true, that plumbers in France have to have studied some philosophy. I think that's maybe true, maybe true for you know, people generally in France, so maybe not. But you take my point. I think there is some value in that. As for regulation, traditionally, the position, I happen to agree with this, the question whether a regulator is needed is based on an assessment of the risk to the public. So where there was, let me give you an example. Once upon a time, there was no regulation of gas fitters, yeah? And people got gassed and blown up and everything else, and most people didn't. Then there was Corgi, the Federation of Registered Gas Installers, I think, and generally the message started to emerge, if you're in your right mind, you use a Corgi registered gas fitter if you don't want to be gassed, blown up and all the rest. Then it became a good health and safety requirement. Now, you can say, for people who get excited about this, that, you know, that's regulating too far, but the degree of risk to the public was perceived ultimately as being high enough. And I'm not sure whether it's law, but it's certainly health and safety executive regulation. So I you know, you have to see that. Other areas, the risk may not be so great, but when you consider that, you know, taxi drivers are licensed and regulated in some way, and so there is a comeback if things go wrong and so on. It's not such a bad question as to what it should be. I'm not saying trades shouldn't be regulated. What I'm saying is that professionals who are in this kind of very close, intimate trust relationship have to think outside the box more than maybe somebody who is fitting joints together. But, you know, please don't quote me as being very patronising on that, because I readily see how that could be perceived that way.
Jay, do you want to defend professions?
Well, I think that, defending professional regulation, so the General Medical Council, which is my regulator, I'm regulated by them, it is not well loved by the profession at the moment. However, there is a list of doctors who have strayed far enough away from what you might expect a professional to do. That has meant that professional regulation is absolutely vital. And those doctors, everybody knows the names of them, don't they? You could shout them out. Can you think of a doctor that is a doctor that says
Please don't.
professional regulation needs to
We need
have
legal
happened?
advice.
I mean, the biggest one is Harold Shipman, isn't it? And then there's Ledwood, and then there's Lucy Letby, and you know there is a list of people in the public eye that show that, unfortunately, however high our own individual professional standards are, there is a need for professional regulation.
Okay. Yes, Nick.
May I just add my two ha'porths to that? I think the question about the distinction between sort of trade and profession is a good question, because I think it's quite tricky, and I suspect that there may be, in a sense, a spectrum between the two, rather than a sharp dividing line anywhere. But I think firmly on the professional side are people who carry out activities under a title and who may only carry out that activity because they are regulated and given that title. Barristers, solicitors are paradigm examples of that. And that is why those professions, in my view, need to think about the correlation between the title and the ability to ply their trade.
Thank you. David? Yeah.
So, Mark Carney, in one of his brief lectures, talks not about values, but about what we value. And it made me think about care workers. And I've spoken publicly about the need for care workers to be registered. Not because I want to create a register which can throw people off, but because I think with a profession goes not just a code of practice, but a set of educational standards and training that allows a group of people who are carrying out the most intimate tasks in caring for older people to be recognised and valued for the contribution they make. That's the Mark Carney point about value. They are not seen as a profession in that sense. I don't think they'd be seen as a trade as well, to be frank, just in that juxtaposition. But I think there is something about how those groups of staff who are delivering the most intimate personal care, who are being trusted to deliver that care, should be recognised and valued and rewarded for the tasks that they carry out. I think registration, not necessarily protection of the title, to be honest, but registration, where entry to the register is a reflection of the training and support that they receive, is absolutely key. It absolutely staggers me that lifting and handling is mandatory training for care staff. Dementia care is not. Yeah, 80% of all residents in care homes are living with dementia. So I think it comes back to, I think the professions that we value as a society are registered. I think there are other groups of people that we should be valuing better as a society that need to be registered, and I'll put care workers in that category. My other reflection, Robert, is you can almost chronicle the history of welfare legislation linked to a scandal. So whether you're calling out doctors that have done something, mental health patients that got in the lion's cage in London, child abuse crises, and I'm not convinced that some of these incidents make good law personally. This might not be the right building to say that in, but
It is.
I do think we need to be careful of the kind of reaction to crises that exist that I think need different types of solution than acts of parliament being passed. But anyway, arrest.
Thank you. Last question, anyone? Last question. Down here. No, sorry. I'm afraid we only got time for one question. Thank you.
Is it on? Hello. Thanks. So Simon Cox, I'm a barrister. Education, schools, the last stage of a compulsory opportunity to advocate to people about professionals, to help them understand that reports of people being disciplined is in some respects a good thing. It's a sign that the system is working and that there will always be some bad apples. And it's not a bad thing. Is there a way in which we as professionals or regulators can assist, encourage educators who already have a very packed agenda, I know, to squeeze more into secondary schools in particular before people leave that compulsory system and go off into the world?
If I can put one pennyworth in on behalf of the Inn, which is that we do, or volunteers from the Inn do quite a lot of outreach to schools in which we try to do some of this stuff, but admittedly that is a drop in the ocean because we can't possibly cover all the schools in the country. Who would like to have a go at this? Anna, come.
Yeah, okay.
You've got a lot of professions to educate them about.
Absolutely. Well, I'd love to say I'd learnt something on the way, but with that, I wanted actually to address the point about how the world sees it when a doctor is struck off, for example. And I remember a GMC meeting I'd arranged in Scotland where the editor of the Glasgow Herald, who for the life of me, I can't remember his name, Arnold something or other, was a famous newsman of the time. And he said, he was talking about news coverage, and the GMC grandees were saying how awful it was that newspapers made so much of a bad doctor being struck off and what have you. And he said, you're looking at it the wrong way round. He was absolutely a newsman to his fingertips. And he said, in fact, it appears on the front page of a newspaper because it's rare. If it were happening all the time, remember, 1950s, it was murder, it was the front page of the newspaper. Now, it's going to be a very special one before it gets that far. And it's because it's rare. And although the readers of the newspaper won't articulate it this way, what it does is to subtly underline in their minds that most doctors are okay. And the fact that one is struck off and held up as an example, it shows, regulator does its job. It's not a headline. That's not going to hit the news. But, naughty doctor is struck off is a good headline. And in fact, it tells the same story. So it's in that. So don't worry too much when someone gets struck off. What you should worry about is their behavior, not the fact that they've been struck off, because it helps people to see the profession is looking after its own standards. But it also underlines the fact that this is extremely rare.
I'll come to the others in a moment. I just to reinforce that point. When I did the Mid-Staffordshire report, which was after all a pretty extensive scandal with possibly thousands of people having died or certainly had huge suffering. I actually, some little while later, met the man who does the Ipsos Mori poll, and I asked him, was there any change following that report and the publicity that went with it? And he said, none whatsoever. However, I would also caution that, because I think that accumulation of scandal and, frankly, the sort of stories coming out of the health service at the moment, is there a tipping point beyond which the public suddenly abandon that big word that everyone's been talking about, which is trust? But anyway, so, the question was about education, I think.
So I used to run a medical school, and one of the things that I learned is that there's a difference between teaching and learning. And you can teach someone till the cows come home, but unless you change the culture, people are not necessarily going to learn. And it used to drive me potty that something would happen and people would come in and say, you must put this in your curriculum. And some of it was great, but most of it went in the drawer and not in the curriculum. So actually we need to change the appetite for learning rather than insist that we should be teaching.
I think it's a really good question. So the intake to universities in the autumn of 2020, so more young people going to medical school and nursing school than ever before. And whilst it's gone down, it's still not gone below what the pre-COVID entrance was. So it's still at a higher point than that, although it's gone down from that 2020. So I thought it was fascinating that in the middle of quite dramatic news bulletins around what the reality is like for Jane's colleagues that were working in delivering services to the most poorly people, there was an appetite for young people to go to medical school. There was something in that, I think, that drew people in. And certainly in the role that I've had recently at Health Education England, the outreach into schools, I think, is critical. And I think we need to do more. And I connect it back to the question that Rebecca asked earlier about what we're going to do about diversity and inclusion. And I think giving young people in their formative years as they're beginning to make decisions and choices about what they want to do, some window into what the possibilities are and potential is of the careers is actually quite important. So recently I'd gone to visit the hospital in Preston in Lancashire Teaching Trust, and they've just got a whizzing new scanner. And they took me in to see this scanner, and I have to say it was terrific. And they were really proud, and it'd be 25% more efficient. And the medical scientist who ran this explained all this to me. And then as people wandered off, I was talking to him, and I said, who runs this? Who maintains it? And this group of scanners he'd got in Lancashire had 10 engineers that were required just to keep this stuff on the road. I don't know how many careers fairs are actually going on that are giving young people a sense that one of the jobs they can work in the NHS is working as an engineer on some of the sophisticated machinery that's coming in. Because I don't think we do that. If you look at careers in healthcare, it's a doctor and a nurse, often in scrubs. And actually there's loads of things, bioinformaticians, data scientists, analysts, computer scientists, engineers. And we need to do more, I think, to actually spread some of that knowledge about what the opportunities are. And that's why I come back to widening participation. There might be tradespeople to use, I think, a term that my father would have recognised, that actually our public services in the future are going to require on having a diversity of skills and talents to help support them. And it's not just the registered professionals who have protection of title who are going to be key. They're part of it, but they'll be just one of a team that is required to keep services on the road. And I think we just need to think less exclusively, more inclusively about what are the skills we'll need in the future.
On that note, I'm going to draw a halt to that so that our speakers can get a well-earned drink, and so can you. You will be able, for a short time at least, to see them outside to ask the question I've not allowed you to ask in here. Can I end by thanking all our speakers for extraordinarily well considered and thought-provoking talks. I think it's given us a lot to think about, But most reassuringly, it seems to me that the problems I complained about at the beginning are shared amongst a number of professions, and maybe one day we'll think about collectively about how we can solve some of them. But thank you very much to all of you.